guys. Thank you so much for being here. We are really excited to be here talking about civic innovation, urban innovation, and really, I guess the impetus behind this chat today is really the sort of confluence of events that we're experiencing right now. 81% of Canadians now live in and around cities. The same is true in the US. By 2050, 2/3 or even over 2/3 of the entire world's population will be living in urban areas. This is clearly a trend that's not going away. And just at the same time, a lot of municipalities, a lot of states are struggling to keep up with a lot of the technology trends that would allow them to be efficient, to be effective, to communicate with citizens, and just provide all the quality of life services and amenities that make it so great to live in cities like Montreal. So we're all here with a little bit of a different perspective to kind of share with you what we're thinking about in terms of urban innovation and startups specifically, who can kind of step in and shoulder some of the burden that municipalities and states can't really necessarily do on their own anymore. So the format of this chat is kind of like a I've never done one like this before. Basically, I'm going to start by interviewing Dharmishta, and then Dharmishta is going to interview Shaun, and then Shaun is going to interview me. And then we're going to open it up to the audience. We'll see how it goes. But maybe before we get started, we can all take a minute to kind of talk a little bit more about our background and sort of our thoughts on urban innovation. Shaun, you want to start?
You put me on the spot.
Yep.
Immediately. I thought I was just going to sit quietly while you interviewed Dharmishta. Hi, my name's Shaun Abrahamson, and just a quick bit of background. I think we have 2 minutes, right?
Yeah.
10, not 2.
So you got a minute to give your own background.
So I've been angel investing for close to a decade. Companies like ZocDoc and TrialPay. And sort of what's interesting to me is I was very early on excited about the healthcare space. And a lot of the things that I hear now are very similar when I look at urban challenges. So things like, it's too complicated. Startups have no business being in that space. Leave it to the billion-dollar global IT companies. So I'm excited about the space because it sort of seems like exactly what was happening in health IT about 7 or 8 years ago. And I'll share a bit more about specific thoughts later.
Dharmishta?
So, loud. Okay. I'm Dharmishta Rood, and I run the Code for America Accelerator program. Code for America is a nonprofit startup. We actually work also outside of America through our Code for All program. Just wanted to let all you Canadians and other people from around the world know. And we work with local governments to facilitate modern technology for both governments and local communities. And today, I'm actually very happy to announce we've selected our accelerator class. We announced just this morning. And so I'll be telling you more about a couple of our companies when we get into questions. But we have 5 companies, Amigo Cloud, MuniRent, Product Bio, Seamless Docs, and Trailhead Labs.
Woo. And I'm Clara. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Tummel, which is an urban ventures accelerator based in San Francisco. We work with early stage startups that are looking to develop consumer and business-facing products or services that solve community problems in cities. So the kind of companies that we're working with are not necessarily looking to get hired by government or embed their product or service within government, but instead try to sort of go directly to the community to get them sort of excited about solving some of their own problems. So companies we work with are like HandUp, which is a crowdfunding platform for the homeless that actually Shaun has invested in. WorkHands, which is like a blue-collar LinkedIn type service. Let's Make, which is like an Airbnb, but for maker spaces. It really runs the gamut. So why don't we start the interview portion? I think I'm responsible for interviewing Dharmishta. So Dharmishta, maybe we can start by talking a little bit about, why is it that you think that startups are uniquely positioned to kind of step in and actually directly work with government and solve some of their problems?
Great question. So as you were just speaking about, over 50% of the world's population now live in cities. And technology is uniquely suited to work with individuals in these densely populated urban centers. And if companies can work directly with government, then they can achieve immense impact. And we're starting to see a lot of trends in government where there's a lot of interest in reforming procurement. It's something we're spearheading at Code for America, along with multiple local governments. And so we're just entering a time very similar to healthcare a few years ago, when urban centers are really becoming very interesting to startups.
Well, I guess my question is maybe a follow-up to that. I think a lot of startups, when you hear sort of startups that are looking to work directly with government, a lot of them complain, like the first thing they complain about is, just getting hired. Like going through the procurement process, responding to an RFP is super challenging. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why those processes are in place, because they are in place for a reason. And then sort of maybe give us some examples of startups that have done a good job of kind of dealing with the pain that is going through that process.
So I could jump in and say, procurement, it's very slow. It's very difficult for startups. It takes a long time to sell to government. But that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you about how it's very possible to sell to government. And I'm going to tell a little story about GitHub. And then we'll, through this, learn about RFPs. So GitHub, as many of you technologists may know, is a social coding platform. So you may be writing code by yourself. Your code may or may not work. And you just save it locally on your computer. On GitHub, you can post that code. Others can edit it. They can what's called fork the code. They can edit the code. You can submit request bug errors in GitHub. And so if you're doing a formal RFP process, this will relate to GitHub in a minute, I promise. If you're doing a formal RFP process, which is request for proposals, which is how governments interact with companies if the companies are selling above certain dollar amounts. And so these bids must happen in public, which are typically happening online these days. So what happened in Philadelphia was when their chief data officer was Mark Head, he decided to run an RFP, not through a clunky website, not through a paper process, but through GitHub. So they posted on GitHub this request for proposals, and to respond, startups then responded in the interface typically used for writing code. And as those proposals were submitted, they could find missing pieces in the applications and submit errors the same way you would say, I found a bug in this code, here's an error. They could resubmit pieces of that application. You've talked a lot about the startup side of the equation, but what can either governments do or just in general the environment of a city to facilitate civic startups?
So, probably the most interesting thing at the moment are open challenges. And so some of those challenges take the form of open procurement calls, and others like New York City Big Apps are a little bit more open-ended. But I think that there are ways for cities to highlight the problems that they care about and then convene all the relevant stakeholders. So in a place like New York, the Economic Development Group has brought together some angel investors, some founders, some mentors, and I think the cities underestimate their ability to convene and be, sort of the place where everyone can come together. So that's one theme. Sort of the open challenge theme seems quite interesting. I'm keeping it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. I have questions. Many questions. All right. So I guess what's interesting is just the contrast in style. So you started Tummel to focus on cities, but not government. So maybe you can explain what that means.
That's right. Cities, not government. Sometimes with government, but not in government. The idea behind Tummel really came from what my co-founder Julie and I were seeing when we were still in business school around startups that were making a huge impact in the community, and they were scaling a lot more quickly than traditional community organizations were, but they were having a lot of trouble. I don't know how else to describe it, but some companies like Uber, like Airbnb, like a Revolution Foods, which is a healthy school lunch provider in the United States, these companies were developing really interesting solutions, and they weren't even necessarily self-identifying as social impact, but they were having a huge community impact everywhere that they went. And they were just scaling so quickly, and we wondered why there weren't more of them out there. Like, if these companies were, at least in theory, developing such effective solutions, why weren't there more? Like, why is it that we all talk about the same, like Lyft, Uber, Airbnb? We talk about the same ones all the time. Why aren't there more? And so basically, we did a lot of research and found that there are a number of really serious challenges that are standing in the way of companies like this. The first is that they don't get a lot of seed funding, and if you're an early stage startup and you don't get seed funding, you're not going to become a late stage startup. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're working on like physical products or services, so like a bike share, pulling together a fleet of bikes is just a lot more expensive than, say, working on an app in your basement. Or they're working on something in the new economy space, or they're working on something that is, very openly social impact, like a crowdfunding platform for the homeless, in which case more institutional investors are really reticent to step in this. They say, like, come back to us when you have a lot of traction. We'll be more comfortable sort of taking a risk on you then. But we also found that a lot of these companies need help from civic and government leaders just kind of navigating a lot of regulatory gray areas. The sharing economy is relatively new, and most rules that might apply to a hotel industry or a restaurant industry or a taxi cab industry were written before any of these new innovations came about. And so it's really hard for a lot of these companies to figure out how to operate. Or they're looking to get hired by, say, like a public-private agency. So we have a company called Valor Water, which is basically provides data analytics to water utilities to help them run more efficiently, because they have this sort of, which is funny, I never really thought about it before this, they have this sort of conflict between needing to conserve, but when a water utility conserves, that means they sell less water, and so it's really challenging. So this company has found a lot of success selling to private utilities, which are very common in the U.S. I'm not sure about here, and so it's been interesting. But figuring out, like, how does one relate to a public-private agency? What kinds of things can you do and can't you do? So it's been really interesting. But yeah, so those are the kind of companies we focus on, and we specifically try to tailor our program to address those particular challenges. So we invest in them at an early stage, and we also hook them up with entrepreneurs who we think have been really successful in the space. So like they'll work with the director of sales from Yelp to develop a local sales strategy, because once you figure out how to sell in Montreal, going to Toronto, it's completely different. Or even going to the suburbs of Montreal could be completely different. Or they'll work with the director of public policy at AirBnB to develop a public policy strategy, because once you figure out how to operate in San Francisco, just going across the bridge to Oakland, it's a completely different set of rules and a completely different set of regulators. So that was my long-winded answer.
That's okay. This has to be short, though.
Yeah,
No,
short.
Okay. So you are third cohort?
Yes.
Right? And so what are some of the trends over, it's like a year and a half, almost 2 years, right?
There are a couple trends that we're really excited about right now. I think mobility, obviously, is one that everyone is not surprised by. I think, to a large extent, that's just a result of the fact that there have been some successes in the space, and so people think of that industry a lot and think about starting companies in that industry. But some other industries that are verticals that we're interested in, like formalizing the informal economy, has been something that someone informed us the other day that we were working on, and I was like, oh, that's true. So like we'll work with pop-up stores, which basically works to aggregate and sort of organize pop-up vendors to sort of pop up at festivals like this, or at corporate events, or neighborhood fairs, and sort of provide them with a regular source of income, or Let's Make, which is like that Airbnb for maker spaces. A lot of these companies are looking to sort of take interactions that are happening offline and pull them online. That's a trend that we like a lot. A lot of sort of small business services, which I guess oftentimes is sort of overlaps with that informal economy. So one of my favorite companies that we worked with is called Kid Admit, which is a common application for preschools. I'll back up and say a lot of our companies are working to solve problems that have been identified by municipalities as serious problems or priorities, but that they haven't been able to fix on their own. So like in San Francisco, there's a mandate for universal preschool. That's sort of what we're working for. But 95% of preschools are private. They're small private businesses. And so there's very little that municipalities can do to kind of like manage that process or streamline it, because they're not in charge of the preschools. And so Kid Admit is basically a common application that kind of aggregates all that information, provides a back end that preschools can manage, and a front end that's really easy for members of the general public to use, which is really awesome, because in a place like San Francisco, you have to apply to, I think it's 7 schools to get into one, and that's like regardless of your income level or socioeconomic status. So that can be really tough, and it's a big challenge. Like a lot of these, I think, all of the problems we've been talking about on stage are really big and maybe not necessarily sexy. Like, you don't say like preschool and people go, yeah, like let's start a preschool company. But to give you some context, in the United States, 25 million applications are submitted annually to colleges everywhere in the US. 35 million applications are submitted to preschool. And Kid Admit has no competition. And so it's thinking about these problems that are big, that affect a large community, but that may be overlooked because they're maybe not in the sort of interest level of 20-year-old white dudes, and thinking about how you can develop companies that sort of address those issues. No offense, 20-year-old white dudes, if you're in the audience.
I'm slightly old. I'm not a fan.
Maybe one more question, and then we can open it up to the audience.
Okay. So last question. It's sort of interesting when you talk about, and we've had this experience of talking about, we want to help cities, and there's some social good component, and we find that in general, a lot of investors have a hard time with. There's a great return and high growth and an IPO, and by the way, you're making cities better. So how are you finding investors, and how do they respond to the companies?
It's a great question. It's been interesting. When we first started Tummel, we assumed that social investors would love us, would get it, would be investing in our companies, just throwing money, and that wasn't the case at all. They basically said, we love all of the companies that have gone through your program. Tell them to come back when they're ready for their Series A or even Series B, which is just much later down the road. And all of our companies that have raised money have found success actually with traditional tech angels, which we were completely shocked by. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they put their business model first. They sort of said, look at this huge customer base that we're cultivating, look at this incredible technology that we're developing, look at all the traction we have, and it just so happens that we're applying it to a problem that affects, not the 1%. And I think it really was we were surprised by the fact that social investors have really not taken a stand. I don't think this is necessarily just for the urban impact space. I think this is something you'll hear a lot, that social impact investors are not early stage investors, and that's really problematic. Because if you want to see companies that are solving procurement issues, that are dealing with, snowplows in Atlanta, you have to pay for them. Somebody has to pay for them. And so, but if you are a company in that space, putting your business model first and then sort of explaining afterwards the social impact, I think is probably the right move if you're going after investment. So maybe we can open it up to the audience now, since we just have a couple minutes left. I can give you my mic if you want.
Yeah, this isn't directly related to cities, but because you guys talked a lot about procurement, just a note of interest for Canadian startups. The federal government has a new program with URL buyandsell.gc.ca, and it's to help actually startups get contracts of up to $500,000 with the federal government, and they evaluate your product. It's quite a quick turnaround. I think they aim for 6 months, and you can get a foot into the federal government door in Canada much quicker. So yeah,
That's
just
awesome.
a procurement note.
We've got Shaun taking notes here.
Yeah. I'm assuming this is
One more question. My name's Alex, and I submitted my app for the Big App Challenge in New York, so I'm very familiar with this space. One of the things that I'm sort of concerned about, interested to find out from you guys, is how much of this stuff is happening at scale? How many cities and municipalities are looking for technology, are open to ideas from startups, and are willing to put money behind them?
So I have some anecdotal evidence that may be helpful. Recently, at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, our Director of Government Relations gave a talk on procurement and procurement reform, and it was hands down the most attended session at the conference, at least according to him. And I think we're seeing an increasing interest in startups and in innovation and in efficiency from government, so it's happening.
Just which year, out of interest, did you enter the Big Apps?
I'm sorry,
Which year?
This year.
Oh,
okay. So this is recent.
So it's 5 years in, right? So I think we sort of crossed this interesting point where, in the beginning, was sort of an anomaly. I think it was a PR stunt. Apologies to the economic development people in New York, but I don't think they knew what they were doing. But this time around, they actually have been very thoughtful about how they solicit, all the way through to how they fund and advise. And so I just think there's been some maturing of the process so you can assure better results. And so just as an example, 2 weeks ago in London, there were 50 cities that got together that have all run open procurement all over the world. So this is Moscow, Barcelona, maybe one of the best, although they don't always have enough money to invest, but they have probably one of the best processes that I've seen. But my sense is that this is something that's been happening for 5-6 years, and we've got to a point where cities are asking each other about how to do it, what they should work on, how they can team up. Like Philadelphia has got to the point where they picked a vertical around public safety, right? But now there are other cities that are saying, can we look at the things or the solutions that were submitted? So it's far from perfect, but it's so much further along than it was in the first generation. And I think there's real intent that people who show up, who have money, who have ability to make an impact, who want to invest, and that's all positive. So hopefully I'll ask you afterwards what your app is.
Maybe I'll just jump in and say a good first step when you're looking for cities to potentially partner with, obviously just anecdotal, I would say look at who's working in the mayor's office. If they have a chief innovation officer, if they have a civic innovation person, they're more likely to be open to being an early adopter and a partner. Although, frankly, the tumble companies work less closely with, municipal officials, but oftentimes have to engage for things like dealing with regulatory issues or getting public space permits. And frankly, your best friend is a lobbyist. And I know that sounds gross, but it's true. There are a lot of really interesting officials who probably don't self-identify as lobbyists, but may call themselves a government advocate. They're there to kind of shepherd a lot of bigger companies through those same processes that startups are looking to deal with. And they can be really helpful. And I think a lot of them get that companies like Uber are potentially really awesome clients to have. And so they're really open to helping you. You obviously need to be aware of their business intent, but I think there are a lot of people who can help you sort of shepherd you through the process, even if they aren't technically government officials. And being open and creative is going to put you in good stead.
And one last thing to add while we're on this subject is the multi-city innovation campaign that was Palo Alto, Nashville, Boston, and Raleigh. And it was, for those of you who don't know, was a group of cities that said, we're going to get together and fund innovative ideas coming out of hackathons. And so each city said, we're willing to put in up to $5K. Not all 4 cities had to put funding in, but then these small ideas could get funding. And so there's a lot of new funding models and innovation models. Or another example is in Portland, there's a innovation fund of $1 million for local startups working on Portland issues. So cities are listening.
So I think we have to wrap it up. Oh, 2 more minutes? Okay, one more question? Or 2 more questions. Go for it. Why not?
Well, you talked about, impact investment, saying that it was quite difficult to find those kind of investors. Are they very demanding after you got, a deal with them? About measuring the impact you have on communities.
Yes. And I think the challenge is there are a lot of metrics and no one's really settled on, there's Gears, there's Iris, there's B-Lab, which has its own impact assessment, which some of you may be familiar with. They're all different and no one's really set on a standard. And frankly, most of them don't apply to startups. So our first cohort, we made everyone do the B-Lab impact assessment. And they all did so badly on it, even though they're all social impact companies. And it's because they asked things like, what is your carbon output? And what is your carbon footprint? And they're like, we're 3 entrepreneurs out of a co-working space with 3 laptops and 3 cell phones. There isn't really much to measure, and in terms of reducing that, it would be very challenging. And so there really hasn't been a lot done to kind of help startups deal with that process, which makes it even harder to communicate to impact investors why they should commit to them.
One experience has been, I've noticed that the sort of leading edge of sort of social impact investing have carved out funds that they are not using for grant making, but using for investing. So they have just easier criteria. And so it's not that they don't care about the impact investment, but they don't have to measure. They can measure in a more traditional, looser way, and that sort of gets around some of the issues. It does present some challenges because now we've got this weird space where you have companies that look like they could be nonprofits, but they are public benefit corporations. So actually, Urban Us is a public benefit corp for that reason. But that structure only existed in Delaware since I think August of last year. And so there are more and more companies that are achieving social good, are for profit, and then some of the social impact folks are setting up money that is capable of investing in those types of entities. So.
One more question.
Yes. So Montreal just started its own city, intelligent city office, the straight translation. So trying to do some kind of digital innovation. What is the one piece of advice you can give to the new chief of this office who just started a month ago or so?
Come hang out with us at Code for America.
Cool.
Yeah, I would just say there's at least 5 cities that have done this really well. So San Francisco, New York, Barcelona, Philadelphia. I'll stop at 4. That's not because
That's
now
not
I'm more.
good.
No, because I'm going to make a mistake with the 5th one and offend a bunch of people. But yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of cities that have been doing this for a while that have built out teams around this and have lots of war stories, and they're happy to talk about it.
So those are great answers. I have nothing to add to that. I'll just say thank you guys so much for coming, and also that Dharmishta and I are going to be doing office hours tomorrow. So if you guys have any follow-up questions, we're going to be hanging out, getting some drinks, so you can hang out with us too if you want. So thank you.
Cool.